I now call Patrick Harvie to be followed by Bob Doris.
Oh dear, I might be about to burst the bubble. In general, I find it hard, I have to say, to welcome much enthusiasm, to find much enthusiasm for the motion or the amendments. There is undoubtedly some good work happening under the Road to Recovery strategy. I don't doubt that for a moment. And I also don't doubt some of the original intention of the strategy. I think recovery, and the government's emphasis on the use of that term, was an attempt to break the conceptual barrier between harm reduction on the one hand and abstinence on the other, this polarised debate that we'd had before. Has it succeeded in that? I'm less clear that it's been successful. I think there is still a tone, an undertone perhaps, of refusing to see any kind of recreational drug use as a part of any kind of normal life. For some people, abstinence is still an ideal which should drive policy in this area. Now, as a Green Party MSP, I obviously welcome a bit of idealism in politics. I'm not opposed to that. But I can't say that I share this particular ideal. And nor do many of the advocates of abstinence. I've seen lots of them enjoying a glass or two of wine, or a beer, or a few whiskies. There is a dishonesty and a contradiction, even sometimes a hypocrisy, about our society's approach to recreational drug use. Scotland's most common, most widely available, most profitable and most harmful recreational drug, of which I am an enthusiastic user, is the subject of continual debate in this chamber on harm reduction, licensing, taxation, even minimum pricing. And yet, almost nobody advocates prohibition of alcohol or even abstinence as a policy message. And as many speeches are made in this chamber about protecting our drinks industry and our independent pubs, quite rightly, as are made about the public health issues which alcohol raises. There's a tension, but not a contradiction there. We recognise, I think most of us, that this substance, alcohol, this recreational drug, while harmful, is also acceptable and can be part of a normal life. There's no attempt in relation to alcohol to suggest that all use is misuse. So why do we get that kind of approach in other drugs? Why don't we see that kind of honesty in the debate about other drugs? I'd like to quote someone I rarely quote, I have to admit, Labour politician Eric Joyce, who wrote in a comment headlined, "Politicians lie about drugs because pretty much everybody else does," and talked about the instance of methadone, the banning of that just before the election. "Agreed by all parties," he said, "a perfect illustration of how the drug's lie operates. 2 people were found dead having consumed a bunch of substances, including methadone." That was one of the substances they'd consumed. He goes on, "It turned out that neither of the post-mortems in this case revealed even a trace of methadone. The legislation was, of course, simply designed to make everyone feel good about fighting the scourge of drugs while actually doing nothing of real value about it." Later in the article, he says, "I don't advocate drugs legalisation." So this is someone who doesn't share all of my views about the subject, but I think both of us would conclude that there's a need for a more honest debate about the options in front of us. And I think that honest debate is beginning to happen. In Portugal, for example, in 2001, Portugal became the first European country to abolish criminal penalties for personal drug possession. And in addition, drug users were to be targeted with therapy rather than prison sentences. And so we must underline that there is not a contradiction between the harm reduction approach and recovery, which the Scottish Government emphasises. And since that policy was introduced, the rates of overdoses, drug deaths, and also of HIV cases among injecting drug users have been reduced significantly. In California, later this year, in November, at the same time as the midterm elections, we're going to be seeing a public ballot on legalising and controlling cannabis in the same way that alcohol is controlled, so that adults 21 and over will be able to possess up to 1 ounce for consumption at home or in licensed business establishments. And it will give state and local governments the ability to tax the sale of cannabis for adult consumption. And in the UK,
Margaret MacDonald, briefly, please.
Regarding the classification of drugs, is the member advocating that this Parliament as a whole, if we agree with his analysis, should approach Westminster about a reclassification?
I think the
Mr. Harvie, you're in your last minute.
I think the current classification system is largely nonsensical, and among the other comments which a string of UK researchers, health professionals and some within the police forces have said is that the reclassification system needs to be looked at again. Fundamentally, does the current legal context help or hinder in reducing the very many forms of harm? Well, what do we see when we look? We see, after decades, generations in fact, of this approach, widespread availability, including to young people, at cheap prices, of products which are more powerful, and criminalisation has increased the trend towards more powerful products, and often drugs which are contaminated with even more toxic substances. And all of this industry in the hands of criminals, including some of those responsible for appalling levels of violence and exploitation. If that's the result, after nearly 40 years of the Misuse of Drugs Act, what's the objective reason for thinking the next 40 will be any different? Defeat the dealers, says Mr. Kelly, and it's the same kind of simplistic nonsense as a war on drugs. It's time to stop mouthing such simplistic slogans to try and persuade ourselves that we're doing anything useful.